Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. Let me set the stage for you. So if you're a political commentator, as of yesterday, you're like, cool, I'm like really close to being on vacay. Like, I'm just going to get through the continuing resolution is going to happen. The government's not going to shut down Friday. I'm going to get to go to a beach and hang out and have a little drink with umbrellas. And then yesterday, after 4 o'clock, that dream gets dashed because President Donald Trump is now opposing House Speaker Mike Johnson's plan to avoid that government shutdown, instead now calling for a new approach that includes raising the debt ceiling, making it very complicated as to what that road is. Joining us is Henrietta Treyz, Managing Partner and Director of Economic Policy at Veda Partners, not sipping on her little umbrella drink. Henrietta, why?
Alix, I feel very triggered by that entire introduction. I do not appreciate it at all. But that you're exactly right. I think that this is an incredibly smart move for the incoming Trump team. They have no skin in the game right now. He's not the president. And what's going to happen next year, as we've been discussing with clients for months now, is that they're going to have to face perpetual risks of government shutdown. And then in July, a debt ceiling negotiation with Democrats. And let's just think about the numbers here. In 2023, 71 Republicans voted against increasing the debt ceiling. There's only 10 blue dogs of the Democratic Conference of moderates who might cross the aisle and vote for a debt ceiling hike sometime this week. So basically, the math just does not add up for trying to get 60 votes in the Senate and 218 votes in the House to increase the debt ceiling in the next 48 hours. But it's incredibly intelligent of Trump to try to get it out of the way because it is going to be a massive impediment to the Republican agenda in 2025 if it's not cleared early.
If there's a government shutdown, won't the blame be placed upon the Republican Party? And if so, how's that calculus work?
Right. It always is. The blame is always placed on the Republican conference. They are the ones who instigate government shutdowns going as far back as Ted Cruz in, 2011, 2013. You know, it's plain to the American voter that Republicans are to blame. But there's a disproportionate amount of Democrats who care about a government shutdown versus Republicans who don't see it as too much of a big deal. The optics are obviously atrocious. You're going to send federal employees home during the holidays over Christmas without a paycheck in the next 2 weeks. You're going to shut all the national parks where Americans are traveling at pretty high rates right now over the holidays. So it's definitely not good optics. It makes Congress look dysfunctional. But what it's really showing us, and the Christmas present for investors right now, is that this is a precursor of just how dysfunctional Republicans are going to be next year. They have not had the votes for government funding bills for a decade. And usually it's Democrats who bail them out. And right now, Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer are holding their party together to say, look, this is your mess. You bail yourself out of this.
Yeah, I feel like I use that with my daughter sometimes too. But the debt ceiling issue, right? Like moving forward the debt ceiling issue, so Trump won't have to deal with it in the summer, but instead that will come under Biden's watch. He said to NBC that he'd like to get rid of the debt ceiling altogether. How do you think that particular part plays out?
Yeah, I mean, that's very, expected from Trump. He, has famously said, let's just see what happens if you default. So I think his position on this is very clear. It's a nightmare for any president to have to increase the debt ceiling because you need to negotiate with the other party. The difference here is that you can, in fact, increase the debt ceiling via reconciliation. So if Republicans do not want to negotiate with Democrats, all they have to do is include a debt ceiling hike in the next reconciliation bill, which the Senate Budget Committee is hoping to mark up as early as the first week of January. So there is an alternative here, and Democrats know that. So if Republicans really do want it off the table, they have a path forward that they just need to carry the votes. They just need to find 217, and there have never been 217 Republican votes for the debt ceiling.
Henrietta, are you surprised that we have heard relatively little, if anything, from the Biden administration? It's President-elect Trump and his representatives taking all the oxygen out of the room about this topic.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important dynamic to all this. We know that Joe Biden, as president and even as senator, has always preferred sort of the diplomatic negotiated solution. Democrats generally believe the government functions for a purpose. And I think if Biden wanted to insert himself into this process, he could. But you're absolutely correct. He's been completely off the radar in this entire conversation, which admittedly only popped up in the last 24 hours.
So what do we think happens? Like, are we extending programming on television and radio on Friday to cover the weekend? Like, what are we thinking here?
Yeah, my odds of a shutdown are about 20% right now, which is admittedly very high for me. I'm usually in the 0 to 5% range of a shutdown, so I'm much higher than I usually am. But I don't think a shutdown is guaranteed. I think that Speaker Johnson and indeed President-elect Trump should want the government to stay open so that on January 3rd, they can get the ball rolling. They can elect their speaker. They can start passing a fiscal year 2025 budget, paving the way for a reconciliation bill on border, and then a future package on the tax package next year. That is, investors should take away one thing today. It's that the tax bill is going to take all year. It's going to be very hard to write, and there's a very strong chance that Republicans have to negotiate with Democrats on it. And that odds are growing as this debt ceiling and CR fight is exhibiting in real time. But I don't think we'll shut down. I think a very short term, maybe 2 week stopgap bill is what we're going to see probably tomorrow morning.
Interesting. Henrietta, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're super busy when all this news breaking here. Henrietta Treyz, Managing Partner and Director of Economic Policy for Veda Partners. She is safely ensconced down there in New Orleans. She's like, I'm not going to Washington or New York, any of that silliness.
Yeah, but she's probably not getting the umbrella drink either. So
yeah, she's not getting the umbrella. She's going to work over the weekend.
There is that.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Alix Steele, Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well, so head over to youtube.com, search Bloomberg Podcast, and that's where you will find us. Again, yesterday, the market really surprised, let's put it that way, on the messaging coming out of the Fed here as it relates to potential cuts in 2025. We had the S&P off 2.5%, the NASDAQ off 3.5% yesterday. Big volume across the board. A little bit of a rebound here this morning. Let's see where we go from here. David Kudla joins us, founder, Chief Executive Officer, and Chief Investment Strategist at Mainstay Capital Management, Troy, Michigan. A great town, by the way. Been there. Hey, David, talk to us about, kind of how you saw the market action yesterday afternoon, and then maybe today. Kind of what's the market telling you about how it views this Federal Reserve?
Yeah, I think that good morning, Paul. Per your lead into the segment, I think the markets and investors were surprised and I think also confused. I think the presser was quite confusing. Jay Powell, if I heard all that and he were talking about why he was hiking rates a quarter point, would have been a good explanation. But they're not, right? They're cutting a quarter point. So there's some real confusion about, where the Fed is headed. Are they making another policy mistake as we speak? And as far as the Fed is concerned, their problem is uncertainty. We have a saying in our industry, right? The markets hate uncertainty. Well, the Fed hates uncertainty too. And they really don't know what to expect for inflation next year, with Trump policies still not being fully known, how they'll get rolled out, when they'll get rolled out, some of those potentially very inflationary. They don't know how much inflation they'll be fighting next year. But the presser was more about the labor market, the other side of the mandate. So the market was just confused in the face of that. I think it was, shoot now, ask questions later.
I guess the question that rose yesterday to many economists is that the Fed is at a risk of making a policy mistake in that they're going to fight an inflation that they don't necessarily need to fight at the expense of the labor market. That was one narrative that some economists were putting out there. What do you think of that?
Well, good morning, Alix. I think they're focused on the wrong thing. I think that 2025 is going to be the year of the stubborn inflation battle, whether it's the massive federal deficit spending that's going to happen, tax cuts, all these things that are good for the economy, but in tariffs, especially, that could cause a rise in inflation. It's that area that is more of the problem, I think, than labor. And that's where you're seeing on the long end of the curve. Look what's happened since September 18th, over the past 3 months. The Fed has cut 100 basis points. The 10-year yield has gone up nearly 100 basis points. That is not the normal reaction function that we expect. In fact, usually the 10-year follows by some degree to what the Fed is doing. So that's the bond vigilantes. Ed Yardenny's coined term back in the 90s. It's a bond vigilantes that are fighting the Fed. And so there's just a lot of confusion out there. I think uncertainty on the part of the Fed. That's why the pressers seem confused. And I think they need to be looking more towards inflation than labor right now, in my opinion.
David, you've been in these markets many years. You've seen all kinds of cycles and news events, and it looks like we may have another government shutdown. As an investor, how does that factor in, if at all, to your outlook?
Back in the mid-'90s, when we had this first government shutdown pending, it was Armageddon, and the markets reacted violently to it. As years have gone by, we've seen that investors in the markets kind of shrug off the antics in Washington, D.C. more and more. And for many of these types of events, we might get volatility for a day, maybe 2 days, but it passes. I think the markets investors have learned to largely ignore it, or have just chosen to, and look at fundamentals. So, whether we get a continuing resolution passed tomorrow, it doesn't come till Monday, there'll be some volatility in the markets potentially because of it, but then we'll move on.
What do you make of the fact that the earnings picture is TBD for next year, and that the consensus and then what the S&P is implying is pretty strong? And then you wind up having this uncertainty about the Fed. Now, some might say it's okay because earnings are going to be really good. We're going to have deregulation and we're going to have lower taxes. So, yeah, we can justify that. But the other side is we just don't know. And if rates stay stickier, as you say, that inflation actually increases a little bit, that consensus might need to come down. Where do you stand on that?
It might need to come down. But if we look at Trump's policies, deficit spending, deregulation, which will be good for U.S. corporations across the board. Tariffs will be good for some, bad for others, depending on if they're a multinational conglomerate bringing products in, or whether it's even smaller mid-cap companies where their input costs will be impacted. But I think net, we're still looking for good earnings growth next year, and that Trump policies net will probably only benefit that.
All right. Thanks a lot, David. Really appreciate David Kudla, founder, CEO, and Chief Investment Strategist at Mainstay Capital Management.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts, or watch us live on YouTube.
All right, Nathan Dean was here yesterday, and now he's back in D.C. I can't keep track on that.
He's got the whole Acela thing going.
Yeah. All right, Nathan Dean, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Policy Analyst, joins us now from D.C. And we had a totally different conversation yesterday, Nathan, when it came to politics. And then today it's like, oh, wait, maybe there will be a shutdown on Friday. Oh, wait, maybe the debt ceiling is in play now rather than in the summer. What is your take and consensus on what's going to happen?
Yeah, so yesterday I said there was a 20% chance of a government shutdown. I'm only going to go to 40%, so I think I'm out of consensus here. But what I'm saying is that I think we're going to have a 40% chance of a government shutdown by Monday. So tomorrow night, obviously the government shuts down at midnight unless a continuing resolution has been passed. But we've seen in the past before, Congress sometimes takes the weekend to figure out a deal. And I think despite all the bluster and the political posturing you're seeing at the moment, I think a deal can be made for a clean CR plus disaster aid, plus potentially the one-year extension of the Farm Bill. Because if something doesn't happen, that Farm Bill and the impact on farmers is going to be substantial in 2025 if the government shuts down. And I think that's going to be what finally gets this deal over the edge. But like you said, the debt ceiling's now involved, and there's going to be a lot more political hiccups to come, certainly over the next few weeks and months.
All right. From my perspective, the politics and the people involved seem a little squirrely to me. I've got a president-elect, and I got some civilian dude really weighing in on this issue in a big way and moving markets. Yet I have a president who's actually sitting in the chair, and I don't hear anything. What's going on in Washington? What are you guys doing down there?
Yeah, so essentially what the Democrats are doing right now is essentially letting the Republicans try and figure out what is the base case scenario. All these negotiations that you may know are taking place in the House with Speaker of the House Mike Johnson. And he was the one that negotiated a deal that Elon Musk and then later President Trump came in and said, no, we're not comfortable with. So what you need right now is the Republicans to come on board with an idea of a bill that will pass the House. And we've even seen Senator Majority Leader Chuck Schumer say, look, from the Senate perspective, we're just going to let the House figure it out first, and then we'll deal with it. And that's where the debt ceiling eventually comes in because, look, you can't really get a debt ceiling deal, I don't think, within another, like, say, 24 hours. These usually take weeks and months to hash out. And if the Republicans decide to move forward with a 2-year extension of the debt ceiling, more often than not, Republicans also insist on cuts as a result of that. So I think what will happen here is the Democrats sort of way back and they say, okay, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, you figure it out. You come up with a plan. You get this plan through the House. And then if that's the case, then we'll move forward and we'll deal with it on the Senate side. Because for everything you're talking about, just remember, this has to be bipartisan because you need 7 Democrats. I'm sorry, you're going to need a lot of Democrats to come forth and get this through on the Senate side.
Is the debt ceiling really in play?
You know, obviously, I think President Trump, when he made the statement earlier today that they should abolish the debt ceiling, that's something the Democrats would actually welcome. We saw Senator Elizabeth Warren even say that she would support President Trump on that matter. I think that was also a way for President Trump potentially to give Speaker Johnson a way out, saying, look, if we can't get the debt ceiling done, but from the market perspective, what I would say is the deadline is not December 31st. That's only the date in which Treasury can use extraordinary measures to keep our funding. The actual X date, if you will, is sometime next summer. So from the market perspective, in terms of government shutdowns and debt ceilings and so forth, we're not seeing much impact from all this political posturing at the moment.
What's the feeling in Washington, Nathan, about the status of Speaker Johnson? Because it feels like he's really under the gun here from all sides.
Yeah, you know, if we had this conversation last week, I'd say it's fairly comfortable in terms of his position, but today it's not. Senator Rand Paul even floated the idea of potentially having Elon Musk to be the Speaker of the House, because you don't have to be a member of the House of Representatives to be the Speaker. Now, I don't think that's going to happen, but a lot of the Johnson allies, if you will, have been sort of questioning whether or not he has the chops for the job early next year. And, you know, that election is going to take place on January 3rd. So I'm not exactly sure I'd be comfortable if I was in Speaker Johnson's position. But that being said, I don't know anybody else who wants the job.
Wait, but let's get back to the Elon Musk thing, because I don't think I think I knew that, but then I think I forgot it, and then now I know it again. So just walk me through. So anyone can be Speaker of the House, like my mom could be Speaker of the House if she gets enough votes?
Yeah, you know, if Paul wants to get back, get into government service, we can have Paul be Speaker of the House. You know, essentially, it's something that goes back to obviously through the Constitution days and so forth. But there's been a lot of talk over the last few years about potentially having President Trump become Speaker of the House during the Biden administration. Obviously, that didn't go anywhere. But the reason why Elon Musk would not want to be Speaker of the House is because, yes, you get to use the bully pulpit and you get to decide what's on the floor, but you also have to get into the nitty-gritty and manage all 220 Republican members next year when you only have a majority of 5. And that is an extremely difficult position when you have to make tough choices like, am I going to shut the government down, or am I going to extend the Farm Bill 1 year and provide all this relief to the American farmer base? That's a tough choice, and that's why I don't think the Elon Musk rumor, if you will, is a serious one.
Okay.
Okay, we're still processing.
We're still processing. I also just feel like, I mean, can you imagine like running the House, or being part of SpaceX, running your AI company, running Tesla? And there's a lot going on there. Okay, so give me some. Well, let's go back and talk about playbook. So we have learned what maybe a Trump playbook for 2025 then looks like. Is this what we can start expecting, right? Like the Congress does something, and then Musk, Ramaswamy, and Trump kind of weigh in different ways, and then that affects policy. Is this going to be the state of play?
I think so. I mean, obviously, you know, a lot has to happen, but I think, you know, one of the biggest issues, if you will, is if they pass a continuing resolution that kicks this into March, now you've got a funding fight within the first 100 days of President Trump's presidency. And it's usually when presidents don't want to deal with funding because they want to use their political capital on things like immigration, border, potentially in this case, a reconciliation package for tax extensions. But if this government funding fight kicks the can to March, now you're going to have Elon Musk tweeting out there saying, look, we need to delete the CFPB. Energy or get rid of the Department of Education. And at that point, you are going to need 7 Democrats in the Senate to agree. You most likely won't. And now you're going to have a government shutdown. Is that a fight that President Trump wants to have within the first 100 days of his presidency? We really don't know. It just depends on the politics per se. But I will say is that we do think a prolonged shutdown, whether it's in March or September of next year, I would bet on September, a prolonged shutdown of 2 to 3, 4, 5 weeks potentially could happen, because right now both parties are saying, look, we're sitting pretty comfortable with the positions that we have.
All right, let's go to what was a front page topic a matter of a week or two ago, which are some of these nominations that have to get Senate confirmation in January. Any update on some of the more contentious ones? Mr. Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., just to name a few?
Yeah, so they're making the rounds on Capitol Hill as we speak. I mean, Senator Fetterman from Pennsylvania met with Pete Hegseth earlier this week. And RFK Jr. is making the rounds today. I would just say that, I think right now and for the rest of December, it's really just going to be more of these like photo meet and greets and so forth like that. We're not seeing a ton of pushback on Pete Hegseth like we saw a week ago. But I think a lot of the fireworks will come down to these committee hearings and obviously these nomination hearings because a lot of the tough questions are going to be asked, and these are going to be asked from both Republicans and Democrats. And so for somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, if a senior Democrat begins to really question on some of those positions, things could potentially unravel. But I will say, remember, the Republicans are going to have 53 in the Senate next year, which means you can afford to lose 4. And so, many of these cases, I think it's going to be pressure for them to withdraw because the votes may be there for them to get across the line.
Amazing. It's going to be fascinating to sort of watch how all of this winds up playing out. We also heard over the we heard it yesterday, we've had about 24 hours to digest, is that the Supreme Court's going to take up that TikTok version. What do we make of that? Like, how do you think that's going to play out in D.C.?
Yeah, so my colleague Matt Shutdown and I were talking about this yesterday, and I really ranged his head on this. This is a question of, this law was scheduled to go into effect January 19th, one day before the inauguration. And there wasn't really, just remember, we're talking about a law here. And so if you want to undo the law, you either need the courts to come in and say it's unconstitutional, or Congress has to pass a new law. And so there isn't really much of a magic wand that President Trump could do on day one unless the Supreme Court were to give that magic wand to him. He could certainly say to the Department of Justice, yes, you don't have to enforce this. But from the Apple perspective, or any other company that offers it on their app store, that's actually not a very comfortable position, because you want to essentially be able to say that President Trump can't change his mind 3 months from now, or a new Democratic administration 4 years from now could say to Apple, look, we understand that, you've been operating against the law. Here's a multi-billion-dollar enforcement action for your problem. So the Supreme Court case is going to be extremely key to whether or not Apple gets any of this clarity going forward and what essentially that law entails.
All right, Nathan, thank you so much for joining us. Nathan Dean, he's our go-to person down in Washington, D.C. as it pertains to all that policy stuff there. And I think we're going to be talking a lot to him in the coming days, weeks, and months, and maybe the next 4 years. Nathan Dean, Senior Policy Analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. He is based in our Washington, D.C. bureau.
This is the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live each weekday, 10 a.m. to noon Eastern, on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.